During the hot Kentucky summer of 1955, an entire family burst into a local police station, shouting in panic that their home had been attacked by aliens. The officer on duty reacted with amusement, but little did he know that what he was now dealing with would become one of the most prolific and well-documented cases of extraterrestrial visitation on record. For most, Kentucky is known for its beautiful, rolling green pastures and world-renowned bourbon, but for others, the bluegrass state is home to many myths and legends, and even some downright terrifying paranormal and supernatural events. Perhaps one of the oldest is the hillbilly beast, a Bigfoot-like entity which is said to stalk various stretches of woodland. Then there is the Pope Lick creature, otherwise known as the Fisherville Goatman, which haunts a local railway bridge and is often heard mimicking a child's voice, calling out in distress to passers-by. Those who venture forth to investigate are later found dead or disappear completely. One of the lesser-known legends speaks of the Little White Men of Kentucky, which is perhaps closely related to the case we're about to present, and which we will explore further in part 2. But for now, let us focus on the state's boldest claim to supernatural fame. A case known not just throughout the United States, but the entire world. On the night of the 21st of August 1955, a household situated in the rural stretches between the communities of Kelly and Hopkinsville in Christian County was apparently besieged by strange creatures, the likes of which the residents had never seen before, or for that matter, since. The event itself was witnessed by 11 people, 8 adults and 3 children, and would later involve up to 16 members of various law enforcements, as well as the military. For those immediately affected, the story is one of bewilderment, incredulity, and ultimately, unbridled terror, and is considered by many to be the definitive account of extraterrestrial visitation. More than 60 years later, not one word of these accounts has changed, and it would all play out as follows. Earlier that evening, Billy Ray Taylor, a young man in his early 20s, exited the farmhouse where he was staying with friends and made his way over to the well some 100 yards distant. Despite the heat, the dying light had brought with it a cool breeze, which stirred the leaves and branches of the trees surrounding the property. It was a welcome change from the stifling interior of the household. He and his wife June were visiting friends for the weekend on a much-needed break from work. The house itself belonged to Glennie Langford, who lived there with her 3 younger children. But it was Glennie's older sons from another marriage, Elmer Lucky Sutton and John Charlie J.C. Sutton, with whom he was most acquainted. They were there too with their wives Vera and Aileen. Aileen's brother, O.P. Baker, had also joined the group for supper. In total there had been 11 people, including himself, sitting inside the parlour, and unsurprisingly, the air had become heavy with heat and moisture. When Glennie declared that they had run out of water, Billy Ray had been first to volunteer in fetching some more. As he trudged towards the rear of the property, he stopped for a moment to admire his surroundings, regarding the lengthening shadows and encroaching gloom beyond the trees. The seclusion and privacy afforded by the encompassing woodland was not lost on him. Maybe one day, he thought, as he reached the well and threw in the pail, he would have the means to purchase his own patch of land just like it. There was a muffled splash as the bucket hit the water, and as Billy Ray worked to retrieve it, he turned his head skyward to look at the orange light of the setting sun. To his surprise, his gaze was drawn elsewhere. He suddenly caught sight of a round metallic object in the skies above the property, glinting in the last vestiges of the sun's rays. It looked to be descending at speed in an arc across the sky, with a multicoloured tail trailing behind it. It was like nothing he had ever seen before. There were no wings or discernible features, and it made no sound whatsoever. It disappeared behind some trees about half a mile distant, an action which was followed by a dull thud, and Billy Ray knew in that instant that whatever the object was, it had most certainly just crashed. Collecting the pail, he ran back to the farmhouse and declared to the others present that he had just seen a spaceship. There was a moment of silence before the room burst into a cacophony of laughter. The consensus amongst the group was that surely this was nothing more than one of those pranks that Billy Ray and Lucky sometimes played on one another. But Billy Ray was not laughing. In fact, he seemed genuinely agitated by what he had just witnessed, and as soon as his companions realised that he was not joking, they tried to reason that maybe he had seen a meteor or shooting star. Unwilling to let it go or pass it off so casually, Billy Ray insisted that Lucky accompany him to the well so that he could point out exactly where the spaceship had crashed and see if there was any smoke or other indication that something was out there. By now, darkness was well and truly creeping in. The two men spent 10 minutes surveying the skyline. It was hard to see anything in the twilight, but there were certainly no columns of smoke anywhere to be seen. Lucky didn't know what to make of his friend's story, but it was clear that something had shaken him. As they made their way back to the house, the sound of a snapping branch suddenly caught their attention. Somewhere out in the tree line, they spotted a dull glow, low to the ground but moving towards them. It wasn't bright enough to be a flashlight, possibly a lantern, but there was no definition to it. They watched as it moved closer, and only as it got to within 20 feet of them did they realise that something about this situation was terribly wrong. They could not believe their eyes, but what they appeared to be looking at was a small humanoid figure with short, atrophied legs and long, thin arms. Its most striking feature, though, was its large saucer-like eyes, which glowed in the darkness. Either side of its head, they could see what looked like large pointed ears, and most disturbing of all was the fact that it seemed to be floating along the ground rather than walking, moving inexorably towards them. The two men yelled expletives, then ran into the house, slamming the door behind them. Glennie, who had been sitting in the parlour with the rest of their companions, rushed out into the hall and demanded to know what the commotion was about. "There is something in the woods near the house," Lucky replied. "Something strange. We best stay inside." Unsurprisingly, his mother did not believe a word of it, assuming that it was all part of a wider prank being perpetuated by him and Billy Ray. In any case, she did not want the children being scared at this hour, and so she sent the youngsters off to bed. Shortly afterwards, Lucky grabbed a 12-gauge shotgun along with his .22 hunting rifle, handing the latter to Billy Ray and instructing him to watch the back door whilst he watched the front. Glennie was just thinking to herself that this joke was all going a bit too far, when she suddenly spotted a small figure standing at the rear of the house. Her blood-curdling scream alerted Billy Ray, who immediately took aim with the .22 and fired. The bullet pierced the netting of the screen door and appeared to strike the strange creature, which tumbled backwards with a metallic rattling sound, and then moved off at speed into the trees, apparently uninjured. Emboldened by the creature's retreat, Billy Ray stepped out onto the porch, aiming his rifle towards the woods when all of a sudden, what can only be described as a spindly hand with long talons reached down from the porch roof and made a grab for his hair. Aileen, who had been standing behind him, yanked him backwards into the house. Lucky then stepped outside, aiming his weapon up towards where the hand had appeared. A shot rang out, and another of the creatures fell from the roof with that same metallic rattle, and then proceeded to hop into the woods, also seemingly uninjured. Once everyone was back inside, JC collected his 20-gauge shotgun and joined the others. No one knew exactly who or what these creatures were, but it was quite evident that there was more than one of them, and they appeared to be completely impervious to bullets. Collecting their thoughts, the distraught men and women of the group began to exchange ideas about what they were dealing with. Glennie, who was deeply religious as well as superstitious, questioned whether they might be demons, sent by the devil himself. Lucky wondered if they were the cave goblins which folk in those parts sometimes talked about, whilst Billy Ray believed they had something to do with the object he had seen earlier that evening. Suddenly the air was pierced by a shrill scream, coming from the direction of the children's bedroom. The youngsters had been instructed to remain where they were, but now they came running down the hall, saying that they had seen a strange face with large glowing eyes peering at them through their bedroom window. Lucky asked his mother to take the children into a room at the rear of the house and suggested that JC accompany them. A few minutes later, there was another scream, as one of the strange faces now appeared at the window in the back room. This was followed by another shot and the sound of breaking glass as JC unloaded with his 20 gauge. Once again, the creature simply bounced backwards, unhurt, and scrambled out of sight. Over the course of the next 2 hours, the family would be terrorised by these small entities. Scratching sounds would be heard on the roof, faces would appear at the windows, the family would look outside, only to see a number of them moving about the yard, or perched up in the trees near the house. Although the beings never tried to enter the residence itself, they seemed especially interested in the children, and each time they got too close for comfort, they would be shot at by either Lucky, Billy Ray, or JC. Between the 3 men, they estimated that there were probably 3 or 4 of the strange beings in total, at which they would fire more than 100 shots. At around 11:30 PM, there seemed to be a lull in activity. Thinking that maybe the creatures had left, the family piled into 2 trucks and drove to the police station in Hopkinsville. The desk sergeant on duty didn't know what to make of their story, and at first reacted with mild amusement. Someone was pulling his chain, he thought to himself. Nevertheless, he had no choice but to take the matter seriously. In the back of his mind, he was at least half concerned that a gun battle might have taken place between local residents, and arranged for the immediate dispatch of officers to the scene. In all, 4 city police, 5 state troopers, 3 deputy sheriffs, and 4 military police from nearby Fort Campbell arrived on the scene at the Sutton farmhouse. They found extensive damage to the property in the form of bullet holes, screen doors which had been peppered with gunfire, windows which had been blasted through, and shot which was found embedded in the frames of doors and windows. Littered around the home were various shell casings. It was quite evident that something significant had taken place, but a wider inspection of the property yielded little evidence. One officer noticed something glowing in the distant trees, but a search of that area returned nothing. At a spot where Lucky had apparently shot one of the beings, officers found a stain that gave off an odd sheen when viewed from a certain angle, but there was nothing really to collect or sample. It appeared the creatures, whatever they were, had left. The family were interviewed at length, and all gave the same consistent account of the night's events, as well as uncannily similar descriptions of the entities that had besieged the farmhouse. Neighbours also somewhat corroborated their story, saying they had seen strange lights in the woods, and assumed it was the Suttons looking for one of their pigs that had escaped. Later they would also hear the gunfire, and reasoned at the time that they were perhaps trying to scare off a bobcat, which was worrying their livestock. Nevertheless, after hours of fruitless investigation, the officers felt they had exhausted their efforts and departed the scene. The next day, neighbours converged on the Sutton property, intrigued by the rumours which had been circulating around town in the aftermath of the incident, only to find that no one was home. As it would transpire, Glennie had awoken at 3:30 in the morning and had seen one of the creature's faces peering at her through the window. The strange beings had returned during the night, but had left again as soon as the first rays of sunlight had appeared on the horizon. The family and their guests had not been far behind. Terrified beyond belief, they had left in their trucks, and it would be some time before they returned home. Over the following months, a media circus ensued. Local as well as national publications, radio and TV stations all wanted to interview the Sutton family and their friends. At first, the Suttons were forthcoming, But as soon as the true agenda behind this interest was realised, one of ridicule and cynicism, they became introverted regarding what happened and refused to comment any further. Of the lucky few who did manage to speak to members of the family in the months, years, and even decades afterwards, all would comment on how each of their stories remained ironclad, unchanged and startlingly similar to each other's, despite the amount of time that had passed. After constant harassment from reporters and souvenir hunters, Glennie and her family vacated the property within a few months. But it wasn't just the barrage of unwanted callers that drove them away. It was the constant fear that those creatures, whatever they were, would one day return. Much has been written about the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter over the years, and it's safe to say that opinion remains well and truly divided over its legitimacy. Many of the police officers who attended the scene that night attested to the family's state of utter panic, along with the amount of damage caused to their property. They would go on to declare on record that they had no doubts whatsoever the family and their guests experienced something, but whether it had anything to do with extraterrestrials was another matter entirely. Skeptics have argued that it was a case of mistaken identity, perhaps agitated by excessive alcohol consumption. Joe Nichol, a member of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, theorised that what the family had actually seen were a mating pair of great horned owls. After all, these are fairly large nocturnal birds which have yellow eyes, fly silently, and aggressively defend their territory. The descriptions of the creatures given by the family do somewhat loosely fit these characteristics, but there are a number of glaring issues. The Suttons described the entities as being around 3.5 feet in height, which is significantly taller than the maximum height of the great horned owl. Secondly, these birds will almost always attack from higher up. They would not, and could not, hover slowly, just mere inches above the ground when zeroing in on a target. The final issue, and perhaps the most obvious, is that great horned owls are not bulletproof, and they certainly do not rattle like tin cans when shot at. In light of this, skeptics then fall back on the possibility that the family were intoxicated, or simply fabricated the entire incident for financial gain. Police found no evidence whatsoever that the Suttons or their guests had been drinking alcohol on the night in question, and they also doubted that a relatively poor family would destroy their own property as part of a hoax. They never made any real money from their story, even though they had ample opportunity to, and the repair costs would have created an extra burden, which they simply did not need. However, there were accounts of people being charged a fee to enter the property in the wake of the incident, which the Suttons readily admitted to, and stated that it was their way of deterring unwanted visitors. Whilst the story seems highly fantastical, so many of the family's friends, acquaintances and neighbours vouched for their integrity in the years following the encounter, stating that it would have been completely out of character for any of them to perpetuate a hoax of this magnitude. Not one of them sought the spotlight, and in fact, they shied away from fame and fortune altogether. They have always maintained that they were the reluctant victims of something they were never able to fully understand, and that the less they had to do with it, the better. As it would turn out, a little-known case which occurred in the spring of 2012 would seemingly corroborate the Suttons' tale, and leave the rest of us asking if the Kentucky Goblins had returned.